Chapter 78. The rusty iron door was slightly open, and a strong smell that was hard to distinguish whether it was chemical or some other strange smell came from inside. The equipment room of this hospital seemed to be very large, and Siddle could hear the sound of two people fighting in the room from the east. It seemed that the woman in Charlie's trunk was quite good at fighting. Siddle remembered that the woman should have a gun, but she had been squatting by the wall in the dark listening for a few minutes, and did not hear any gunshots. She did not know if she ran out of bullets or lost her gun. She squatted next to the slightly opened iron door for a long time, and the two people inside were fighting fiercely, not noticing that there was another person outside. Siddle sat there for a while, and suddenly she could no longer hear any noise coming from the room. She knew something was wrong, and was afraid that something had happened to someone, so she quickly leaned her face through the crack of the door and peeked into the room. The light in the room was extremely dim, and it was impossible to tell what was going on from the outside. But Siddle heard a faint gasp. A painful cough sound came from the corner of the room, as if a lump of phlegm was stuck in her throat and couldn't be expelled. Siddle quickly turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the corner where the sound came from. She saw a shabby woman being pressed down by a strong man, as if a mountain of flesh was pressing down on her. The woman's face was purple, her eyes bulging, her tongue hanging out of her mouth. She desperately waved her hands to struggle, but she could only stir up the dust and couldn't move Malcolm at all. Her face was pressed against the cold floor, just in time to see the light from the flashlight that Siddle shone on. She followed the light, her bulging eyes suddenly filled with excitement. Siddle squinted slightly, her left hand raised the flashlight. When Malcolm noticed the light but didn't have time to dodge, she shot the man in the thigh. Bang! Malcolm was a fat man, he basically didn't have time to dodge before Siddle shot him in the thigh, blood splattered everywhere. He screamed in pain, hugged his thigh and fell to the side, couldn't care about the woman anymore, hurriedly twisted his body desperately, trying to find a place to hide. Siddle didn't fire a second shot. She only had 5 bullets left, still didn't know what would happen next. Siddle planned to keep these bullets to deal with Leatherface. Siddle glanced at the woman. She covered her neck and coughed, then slowly stood up, but she didn't walk over here, but looked at Siddle very warily and slowly backed away. The woman looked extremely panicked, from her hair to her clothes were soaked, there were also many blood stains on her skirt. Her hands were empty, the dress on her body was thin, there was no place to hide a weapon. Siddle flashed the flashlight around and quickly scanned the ground but found no trace of a gun. The woman's lips were pale, her wet hair stuck to her cheeks, her body was still trembling slightly, she was staring at Siddle. Siddle glanced at Malcolm, who was crippled in one leg, ignored him. Instead, she stared at the woman and slowly walked towards her, slowly raising her hand as she walked to signal that she had no intention of attacking. The white light of the small flashlight in her left hand was still focused on the woman's side, but her right hand had raised the barrel of the gun and pointed it diagonally at the ceiling. Siddle stared fixedly at the woman, her voice was both soft and gentle, trying to soothe her panic and anxiety. "My name is Siddle, I won't hurt you. May I know your name? Why are you here?" Although Siddle didn't know the woman's identity, he had no doubt that she had stolen Charlie's gun. The couple acted suspiciously, and their conversation was also perfunctory, clearly avoiding the serious and seeking the light. Perhaps this woman had been tied up and thrown into the car for unknown reasons. After discovering that she had been kidnapped, it was normal for her to steal a weapon for self-defense. However, the woman's mental state seemed to be unstable. She was still biting her lower lip, looking at Siddle in horror, her body trembling slightly, pressing against the wall behind her. Siddle hesitantly took a step forward, but the woman suddenly looked terrified. Siddle. Was she that scary? She immediately gave up on her intention to investigate, took a few steps back, her eyes never leaving the woman, and quietly walked towards Malcolm. "I won't do anything to you, I just came to find someone." Siddle's original intention was to talk to this woman. That was in a situation where communication was possible. She also didn't mind having another teammate who could fight, but this woman with not bad skills and a grudge against her family was in a very worrying mental state. Unable to communicate, and unable to tell if she was a friend or foe, Siddle resolutely gave up on finding a teammate. But leaving this woman here wasn't good either. She said, "You can leave now, climb out the window. There's probably no one else in town now." There was only Duke's corpse. But Siddle hadn't finished speaking yet. Suddenly, there was a clap of thunder, and lightning flashed across the window. The woman's small movements couldn't be hidden under the light of the lightning. Siddle could clearly see the pain and resentment on her twisted face. Siddle. A bad premonition rose in her mind, and she suddenly realized that she had overlooked something very important. But it was too late. The veins on the woman's hand stood out, and immediately after, a cold iron hook rushed straight at Siddle. She seemed to have gone crazy, trembling and throwing everything around her at Siddle. While throwing, she cried out, "You are a devil. Why don't you die?" At the same time, Malcolm, who was crawling on the ground just a few steps away from Siddle, suddenly raised his head. His eyes were fierce, his features were twisted, and his fat body suddenly rushed towards Siddle. Before Siddle could dodge, the rusty iron hook had already hit her forehead. A feeling of pain rushed to her brain, and cold, sweet liquid flowed down her forehead. She blinked indifferently. Malcolm seized the opportunity, his strong body rushed forward. In the darkness, the flashlight rolled to the ground. Another gunshot rang out. It seemed that the man intended to use his fat body to suppress Siddle, winning with his own strength. But he didn't know that although Siddle seemed to be watching the woman, in fact most of her attention was on him. Blood flowed out and spread all over the ground. Malcolm's legs were now useless, he curled up on the ground in pain. Siddle tilted her head to avoid the things thrown by the woman, switched the gun to her left hand, estimated the weight of the crowbar, and bent down to smash it. Clank dash. The crisp sound of broken bones rang out. Siddle's face was expressionless, her movements did not stop. After using the crowbar to break Malcolm's two arms, she stood up straight and looked at the woman who was going crazy with excitement. In the darkness, the woman's figure appeared vaguely. Siddle pursed her lips, slowly raised her hand to wipe the blood off her face. The woman was stunned. "In your eyes, who am I?" Siddle asked again. The moment Malcolm rushed towards her, she felt something was wrong. Before the flashlight fell to the ground, when the light flashed, she clearly saw the resentment in Malcolm's eyes. That level of resentment, perhaps not because she shot him, but more like mistaking her for something else. The woman's face suddenly twisted violently, she screamed like crazy, "You are a pervert. A chainsaw-wielding demon killing people indiscriminately." Squeak, squeak, squeak. The loud and shrill sound of the chainsaw came from outside the door, sometimes far, sometimes near. It seemed like the person holding the chainsaw was wandering in the dark hallway. The woman's screams suddenly stopped. She looked at Siddle in a daze. If the chainsaw murderer was outside the door, then who was this demon with a human face in front of her? The woman's pupils dilated, her expression lost, her lips moving slightly. But she didn't have a chance to speak. Siddle pressed her face against the glass, without warning giving her a knee to the stomach. The stomach had taken too much of a hit, but after receiving several more consecutive hits, the woman's eyes blurred, and she silently lowered her head. Siddle let go of her hand and let the woman's body fall limply to the ground. The equipment room was quiet again, with only the sound of the wind and rain outside the window. Malcolm lay quietly on the ground, passed out from the pain. Siddle bent down, quietly moved to the small flashlight and picked it up. She lightly dusted the flashlight, hearing the sizzling sound of the chainsaw outside the door getting louder. Leatherface was getting closer and closer. Siddle wiped the liquid off her face again. This was probably blood, but she didn't have a mirror at the moment so she couldn't see where the tear on her face was. She could only press her hand along the painful spot and felt a large tear. While Leatherface hadn't arrived yet, Siddle put down the gun, quickly used a crowbar to tear a piece of cloth from the hem of her shirt, and haphazardly bandaged the wound. If the bleeding continued, it wouldn't be easy to hide the traces. Siddle tied a piece of cloth around his head, thinking about the problem between Malcolm and that woman. Just now, in their eyes, she was probably the one they hated the most. Siddle's movements paused slightly, remembering the female corpse, and her cold, waxy eyes, and suddenly understood. She could make people hallucinate. If we take this as a premise, we can deduce what happened after entering the hotel. The female corpse created a hallucination for Malcolm, stimulating his vicious personality. In the hallucination, Malcolm's murderous personality mocked Officer Ed. Because of the hallucination, he might have misunderstood something, stimulating his aggressiveness, making him want to kill everyone in the hotel, and in his anger, he used his left hand to write an unrecognizable line. This was also the goal that his vicious personality had set for itself. After following the Duke police to the small town, the evil personality killed Duke, then met the mentally disturbed woman who was kidnapped by Charlie and his wife. During the fight, this woman might have been affected by the female body. No, perhaps the female body's ability to create hallucinations could cover the entire town. But Siddle was not affected, probably because Ikuta Asahi gave her a left eye that could see ghosts. Not only could she see ghosts, but she could also break the hallucinations. However, Siddle could sense where there were ghosts, but she had never sensed anything from the female body, which meant that body was not a ghost. The female body was still alive. Right now, the female body that could create hallucinations was still with John, Charlie, and some others. Moreover, the most important thing is, no one will be on guard against a corpse. Siddle suddenly shuddered. She knew she had to speed up and return to the hotel. If she returned later, she might just see a room full of corpses. She had to go get a belt to fix her bike and quickly return home. After that, she would never come to such a poor place in the countryside again. There was nothing but trouble. The sound of the chainsaw outside the door was very loud, not sure if it was because the chainsaw killer's IQ was low or because he was too confident in himself. Dragging a weapon that made a sizzling sound that could be heard within a radius of several kilometers, he dared to swagger around in the pitch-black building to capture people. Of course, it was also possible that the tourists who had passed by before were too naive, not having much experience in dealing with such sudden situations, and they were also right in the killer's territory. Without a favorable position, the defensive mentality was also broken. Of course it was impossible to defeat the chainsaw-wielding killer. But it didn't matter. Siddle took out something from her body. After arranging the room, she was satisfied and picked up the gun and pressed it against the wall, trying to breathe easier, carefully listening to Leatherface's movements. Today, she would make Leatherface capsize in the ditch, ***. Capsize in the ditch, Chinese idiom. A boat going in a ditch definitely cannot capsize, but it capsized, meaning the impossible happened, implying bad luck, misfortune. There were 4 bullets in the gun. Well, let him feel a bit of the atmosphere of the new era. Squeak, 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 squeak. The ear-piercing sound of the chainsaw echoed in the empty hallway. The dark equipment room was silent, only the sound of the chainsaw outside the door and the man's heavy footsteps could be heard. Just a little bit more. Knock, knock, knock. The footsteps were accompanied by the sharp, piercing sound of a chainsaw, so loud that it gave people a headache. Siddle quickly realized that the chainsaw-wielding killer was on patrol. He held the chainsaw and continued to walk back and forth in the hallway. Leatherface should have known that an outsider had broken into the town. Maybe Eva had informed him, but he didn't know the exact location of the stranger. No. That's not right. Leatherface should have been in this hospital building originally and rushed over after hearing the woman's frightened scream. Otherwise, he wouldn't have appeared so quickly. In a hospital with such a complex structure and such a large area, he must have heard some noise and kept wandering around this place. When Siddle entered, he conveniently closed the rusty iron door, but it wasn't locked. If he locked the door now and climbed out the window, he could easily leave the equipment room whose entrance was blocked, but Siddle didn't plan to do so. Not to mention that it was pouring rain outside, and his shooting accuracy would decrease by a lot. In the small town outside, Leatherface was probably more familiar with the terrain than Siddle. Although it seemed extremely inconvenient to fight a killer with a chainsaw in such a small space. But in reality, if he really risked running out in the rain, that would be the most disadvantageous option. The sound of the chainsaw rang out outside the door, sometimes far, sometimes near. Even Siddle could judge where Leatherface had gone, then turned back. A man with a mask made of human skin sewn onto his face, in the dark rainy day, holding a chainsaw that kept buzzing, wandering like a ghost in the dark corridor of the abandoned hospital. Side could even imagine the scene in the corridor at this moment. But she didn't panic. She thought it over, bent down, and quietly took a few steps back. When the chainsaw gradually became louder, when he got close to the iron door, she deliberately made a noise. Creak, creak, creak. Hearing the noise, Leatherface rushed forward like a bull in heat, holding a chainsaw and using his heavy body to push open the iron door. Siddle stood in the corner of the equipment room, clearly seeing Leatherface's appearance under the flashlight. The heavy clothes covered with yellow stains wrapped around the man's strong body. He turned his face and saw the blonde girl standing in the corner. Siddle also saw the newly peeled skin on his face. It looked like the face of a young man, with blood still lingering on his face, and the edges of his face were covered with stitches. He peeled off the skin and stuck it on his own face. When Leatherface saw Siddle, he raised the chainsaw in his hand. The chainsaw was half his height, with sharp saw teeth, flashing coldly in the darkness. Siddle saw Leatherface. She raised the gun in her hand. Leatherface's movement to charge suddenly stopped. Even though he had guarded the old chainsaw that had been with him for many years, suffering in the basement of this abandoned town, wholeheartedly taking on the title of a murderer, trying his best to kill every passerby, he still resolutely refused to change his weapon. However, that did not mean he did not know that there was such a thing as a gun in this world. Siddle calmly pulled the trigger. Leatherface took a few steps back. The gun did not fire. Siddle. She pressed the trigger a few more times and realized that the gun seemed, probably, had gone dead at some point. Leatherface. The man with the sewn-on face held a giant chainsaw tightly, the ear-piercing slicing sound rang out. He charged forward, his imposing manner was oppressive, as if he wanted to cut the girl in front of him in half. Siddle stared speechlessly at the unloaded gun in her hand, falling into silence. What the hell is this? The blonde girl in the corner seemed disappointed with herself as she threw the gun at the man in front of her. Leatherface broke it in half without hesitation. Even though there was a convenient killing tool like a gun right in front of him, Leatherface was still loyal to his old, yellowed chainsaw. The sound of the chainsaw rang out continuously. Leatherface charged forward with his chainsaw. He was almost there. The vicious killer was only a few meters away from the beautiful and pitiful girl, unarmed. He intended to use a sharp saw to hurt this poor and weak girl. Wait, he fell. Siddle. Ouch. The wire wrapped around the corner of the table was very convenient. The man's face fell heavily to the ground, making a sound of flesh hitting cement. It must have been painful. People were all reckless like that. Siddle quietly glanced at the various props she had hung on the chandeliers, on the window bars, and in the corners of the room. For a moment, the surroundings were strangely silent. Careful was still the best. The chainsaw slipped from Leatherface's hand. Siddle's eyes lit up. She had long admired this giant chainsaw. Before Leatherface could endure the pain of his severed legs and crawl up, something cold and heavy had slammed into the back of his head. The cold liquid slowly flowed down to the floor. His mind was dizzy. He growled and tried to grope with the chainsaw to stand up. However, when he raised his head, he discovered that the chainsaw that had been with him for decades was in the arms of the blonde girl. Siddle turned off the chainsaw, hugged it in his arms, squatted next to Leatherface and looked at him curiously, suddenly understanding why he liked this chainsaw so much. This chainsaw was very large, the saw teeth were dense, covered with black stains. At first glance it was obvious that it was a good thing to use to slash people. When he picked it up he really felt very safe. Siddle was extremely satisfied with Leatherface's chainsaw. However, when Leatherface looked up and saw this scene, his eyes widened as if they were about to tear. He angrily reached out to grab the chainsaw. For him, the chainsaw that had accompanied him for many years was only second to his human skin mask. It wasn't too much to call it a wife. Who could stand to see their wife in another man's arms? Even though Leatherface was a perverted murderer, he was still very possessive. Then, Siddle tore off his most important human skin mask. "Oh!" she exclaimed indifferently, throwing the young man's face aside, the flashlight shining directly on Leatherface's real face. Wait, this was still not his real face. The reaction of Leatherface, who had his skin/face forcibly peeled off, was beyond Siddle's expectations. Siddle looked as if she had accidentally peeled off Leatherface's skin/face. She was prepared for the man in front of her to go crazy and kill her regardless of the pain. In fact, she had been on guard, always ready to turn on the chainsaw, playing the role of a chainsaw murderer, carrying out a massacre in the rainy night. Although it wasn't evening yet, the sky was almost like evening. However, after his skin was peeled off, facing the beam of light shining straight on, Leatherface curled up, covering his face, somewhat afraid, softly groaning, Don't look at me."